All right, welcome to multidimensional assessment. We're going to talk about the idea of which assessment is best. And here's the most obvious answer for that question. Yes, because the idea of assessment really needs to be geared after a number of different things, and each different assessment has a particular purpose behind it. So always keep those things in mind when you're designing, and implementing different assessments to use in your classroom. So to start with, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it is a fairly good, extensive list of different types of assessments you can use. And we're going to talk about some of these in more detail than others. But these are the big ones, right? These are the standard-made test or standardized test, teacher-made test, all the way down. Some of them you may not necessarily think of as being forms of assessment, like, for instance, observation. I spent 20 years in a high school classroom, and observing my students was something I did on a very regular basis, just to kind of pick up on certain nuances in behaviors, interactions, and it helped quite a bit with understanding what they knew and what they didn't know about the subject I was trying to teach them. Now, there's lots of different ways that we can go about gathering data from students, and that's really what this is about. So when you go to design an assessment and you start to implement the assessment, you want to think about, what is the purpose behind this? Is it strictly to get a grade? And unfortunately, in our world, and especially in public education, sometimes we just have to give assessments for the purpose of assigning a grade. I don't necessarily think that's the best option, but it does do a number of different things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to teacher-made exams, because that's probably one of the most common places. There are a couple others as well. So the assessment you're designing, you're implementing, do you want to get a grade out of this? You want to be able to assign a grade. Do you want to know what your students understand? And those may seem like the same question, but they are different questions. You can design tests, exams, that will allow you to give a grade, but you're not necessarily going to gather any data about what your student knowledge is. And there are ways of doing that. And to prove a point, some anecdotal information here. I had a student, or knew a student once, it wasn't my class, unfortunately, who had made arrangements with a particular biology teacher. And the arrangement was, as long as the student passed the final exam, she would pass him for the term. And that was their arrangement. I'm not going to interject into that. He came in, put B down. It was a standardized exam. He put B down for every single answer. He finished the exam about 5 minutes, laid down his head, and went to sleep. And then he sat there for the next 2 hours, 2.5 hours, whatever it was, for the rest of that exam, for the rest of the students to finish and the time to be called and whatnot. And then he turned his exam in, and it was graded, and lo and behold, he got a passing score on that. Not only just a passing score, but a proficient score on that, just by circling B for everything. He just simply guessed all of his way through. So when we talk about assigning a grade was assigned based on that exam, but it wasn't necessarily useful data. She didn't learn what the student learned. The student guessed all the way through it, and it's actually just kind of terrifying, the fact that the student was able to get proficient simply by filling in B for every single answer. So that is what it is, right? I don't know if they've changed that exam or not, but that's the way it was for quite a while. After that student did that, a number of other students started doing that, and lo and behold, that particular teacher started getting really amazing scores, which is odd. Anyway, that's anecdotally what works for assigning a grade, but there are other ways to assign grades and collect actual knowledge of student understanding at the same time. And that's one of the things you need to make sure that you're working towards as an educator, is, what do my students understand? Assigning the grade should really be secondary, but gathering what the students understand should be the primary piece of that, right? And then, of course, there's also this other piece here, and it's about keeping your job, right? So an exam or data collection or assessment can also prove that you are actually doing your job. So let's start with standardized exams. Now, I can go on for days and days about the evils of standardized exams, but they're in our society. There's not a whole lot any of us can do about them, and so we have to deal with them. They are normally, when we talk about standardized exams, something that is created, controlled by another institution of some sort. It's not necessarily at another school. It could be at the state level. It might be a professional organization. It might be something else, right? And a lot of times these standardized exams are used for accountability for faculty, not necessarily the child, but there are a lot of times they're used for faculty. Sometimes they are used for grades. I've seen that is a thing as well. But the simple fact is, when you start doing all the math behind how these standardized exams figure into a student's overall grade, unless it's a pass-fail exam and you don't pass the class unless you pass the test, and you will fail the class if you fail the exam, there's not a whole lot of accountability for the student, because if they have a really solid grade going into the exam, it's not really dire that they do extremely well in the exam and maintain a good grade and pass the course. So there's accountability issues when it comes to that piece of it. They're not necessarily aligned very well. So theoretically and ideally, yes, it is, but in practice, it's just not there. So you have to be careful about with that. How does it help? Well, that's a big one, all right? So the thing I've always told, I mentored teachers for a long time, and one of the things I always said was that standardized exam, and this is something that I often heard other administrators say and other teachers say, is that when it comes to that time for that standardized exam, it should not be a surprise. Your results should not be a surprise. You may have one or two, you're like, I don't know where they're going to fall. They're going to be right on that cusp, and it really depends on what day of the week it is they take the exam. But you shouldn't be surprised, like, oh, look, 80% of my class failed the exam. That's such a surprise to me. No, that it shouldn't be that way. You're not paying attention to other assessment forms if you get to a standardized exam and you get a different result than what you really expected. There is something that occurred from a mechanical standpoint on the day of the exam, or there's something you weren't paying attention to going into it. But that summative exam, which is a word we probably need to talk about as well, that should not be a surprise. Summative exams should never be a surprise. And I'll harp on that a little bit as well. And a lot of times, again, these are used for grades. So when we talk about a summative exam, we're talking about an exam that is the accumulation of a lot of knowledge. And we're testing, did they learn that knowledge? That's really the purpose behind that. A standardized exam is a summative exam, not unlike a teacher-made exam. And in both of these cases, they're not really teaching tools. They are proof of knowledge. And we've turned the standardized exams into other things. But in my opinion, they're not supposed to be. They were never supposed to be teaching tools. They are, this is where we've missed out on this piece or that piece. So it allows for realignment, but it's not a teaching tool. It's an alignment piece of how we need to focus on this piece and do this better, or pull back on that piece over there. Teacher-made exams are similar, except that these things are made in your classroom. Maybe they're made in conjunction with other teachers in your building who teach that same course. And they can be good, they can be bad, they can be horrible. Multiple choice exams, by and large, are going to be bad exams. They don't really invest or allow you to see a lot of information about what the students are knowing or understanding. Especially in some classes where the purpose is to see how the students are thinking. So, and this can be true in a history class, a reading class, a math class, a science class, any class where you're wanting to understand their thinking. A multiple choice question isn't really going to do that very well. There are ways to design multiple choice questions to really get after a student's thinking, but it requires a lot of time, and it is normally a lot more straightforward just to simply have a student explain their reasoning. And there's actually some evidence in there that talks about this idea of explanation is a useful tool for learning. So there are ways to design teacher-made exams that will encourage learning, or at least reflection, to occur. So that's one of the big differences between a teacher-made and standardized exams. That learning, that reflection piece can be included on a teacher-made exam, which can allow for a summative exam to actually turn into a minor learning expedition, if you will. And again, you should never be surprised by the results you get off of a teacher-made exam. You should know how your students are going to be performing on that exam before you get there. So just keep those things in mind. And this is also another thing about standardized exams. This is accountability For students, this is a way to say, we are going to be taking this test on this date. You need to be ready for it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with encouraging or forcing a student to be accountable to their own actions and behaviors. That's something that's kind of wrong to say, but it's very true in our society that it's still okay to require a student to be accountable to their own behavior, including their own grades. So keep that in mind as you go through things. Other forms of assessment: observations, just simply watching your students, listening to them. What are they saying? What are they not saying? How do they react when you say something? And I taught math, and I'd say something in a class, and I'd look around the room at the faces and see what the reactions were. And if I didn't get any reaction, I would actually stop and say, well, I didn't get a reaction on that. Where are we at? Because the fact that there is no reaction means something, all right? You've lost their interest. There's something going on that there's something that needs to be paused, and you need to look at what's going on in that environment right then, okay? So observations is a big thing that can give you a lot of useful information. Something about talking or the actual discussion, communication with students in the classroom setting, not written form, but in oral form, can be really useful. What is found by a lot of research is that students are actually going to answer questions differently in written format than in oral format. So having them do both is actually really useful. So having a classroom discussion, asking them very pointed questions, maybe some very open-ended questions about different things. In math classroom, it works, like, how do you have a math discussion? Well, we say, what are other ways we can work this problem? Here's a problem that was worked wrong. What's wrong with it? Doing all sorts of different discussions. Some of these discussions don't have to be very long. They just have to exist. So there's different things that we can do to work with that. So think about, and to continue this on, I do this all the time in my classes. I create a question bank, right? Thinking about where the students are going to struggle on that activity. And in the first year you teach a course, maybe you don't necessarily know that very well. And after you've gone through it a couple of times, you kind of get a feel for where students are going to have problems. Like, for instance, in every math class I've ever taught, students have always had a problem with fractions. And it's just a thing. I've taught college calculus students who had issues with fractions. So it's one of those things. Going in, anytime I'm doing anything with fractions, I know that's something I need to address. I need to ask questions. I need to do demonstrations as well that go along with that. But those questions on the front end help me to understand what they're asking. That's a form of informative assessment, right? So that informative rather than that summative information gives me some information on the front end so I can kind of direct. That's data that I can use in real time to direct how and what I'm doing in my classroom, instead of being so rigid, well, this is what I plan to do and I have to get through. It's like the idea of collecting this data informs where you change course and how you do that in real time. That's the reason why you're collecting that data, all right? So a couple other pieces: homework and classwork. Now, one of the things that I for years, I kind of pushed back on when it came to homework is this idea of sending a child home to do homework on something you've done in class. And the student is still learning how to do whatever that is. So you're sending the student home to get help from their parents who may or may not be experts in what you're asking them to do. The whole purpose that they're coming to you in the first place is you are the expert in that subject area. Act like it. Give them access to your knowledge in that area. So that's my disclaimer about homework. I really, especially freshmen in high school, by the time they get to be seniors, you're maybe dealing with a slightly different thing. But as a rule, I never deferred teaching students. I never said, no, you need to get this from someone else. No, I said, I need to be the expert in the room. Here are other resources you can use as well, but I need to be your primary source of information, since I'm the one being paid to be your primary source of information. Be the expert you're being paid to act like, right? So never send a student to help another student if you're available. Never send a parent to help a student if you're not, unless you're not available. So really kind of structure that. With that said, classroom and homework assignments are a really good way to understand what what your students understand. And we can get into the whole grading. Do they get a grade for completion? Do they get a grade for correctness? And both of those have their merit. But if you're just sending work home for a student to do and expecting it to be all done correctly, there's a lot of pressure that's being put on the student. Simply going through and saying, okay, these 20 problems just need to be done. And there's a completeness there. Well, you're getting the students to do the work. So now what you've done is they've demonstrated they do actually have the desire, or at least an inkling to want to get good grades. So they've proved that to you. But the other piece of that is that they do need to understand what they're doing. So classwork allows you to do just that. If you're doing things in the classroom, and the purpose and the way you set up your classroom, and you set the norms in your classroom so that understanding is the goal here, classwork can be a really good way of assessing what they do and do not know, and be a learning process at the exact same time. So you might want to research that out a little bit and see how can you limit the amount of work sent home with the students. I mean, the simple fact, outside of the world of education, people don't go home with their work and continue to work. They leave it at work and they go home. Why should students be any different from that perspective? Why should students go to work for 40 hours a week and then required to do more work at home on their own? We should really build classrooms in such a way that they can pull back and recharge a little bit when they get home. So there's my 2 cents on that one. I'll come off my soapbox now. All right, another aspect of this, and this is primarily for mathematics, but it does have its ways of working in all classes. The idea of problem posing is that here is a topic. Let's create problems. The students create problems in that topic. So if you're talking about a history class, there's definitely ways we're talking about World War II. What are some problems that we can talk about in terms of that? And then we can start talking about solutions and what are the available resources. And they can learn a lot about what's going on in that world and how it relates to our current world simply by building a problem that needs to be answered. And I put problems in quotes there. Maybe that is a good question they need to build. So there's always that teacher in high school that was saying, well, you make everybody make their own questions and I'll use the best ones on the exam. This is not really what this is about. This is about us writing questions as a group and trying to stump. The students stump each other on these questions. And then there's this rewriting process for complexity and clarity of the questions and the problems themselves. The idea here is to build a really solid question that in of itself allows you to gather understanding of a student's understanding. The way they build the question will give you insight to what they understand about the topic. And that can be really, really useful. And there's lots of literature out there about problem posing. Surveys. Some people don't necessarily think of surveys as being a data collection or an assessment tool, but they most definitely are. Google surveys, Kahoots, all sorts of different ones out there, SurveyMonkey, just simply doing a survey of the students, even raising hands, fist to 5. I have one where I use cool and warm colors on their desk. They have a little card and they slip back and forth, so it's really a yes or no type event, really. But the idea is that collecting data, having students reflect on stuff, can give you a lot of insight into what they do and do not understand, what's useful to them, what's not useful to them. And this changes the course from time to time. Like after I did projects in my class, which is another topic we're going to talk in another video here. But the idea about surveys is I would do a survey after a project and says, was this useful to you? What did you learn? And sometimes students would be like, oh, it was too difficult. And those were always students who turned it in at the last minute and weren't working on the process as I expected. Some students said it was very difficult, but I learned a lot. And those are the students that engaged during that process, right? So doing surveys gives you more data about your students. The data you're collecting from your students isn't just did they learn what you wanted them to learn. It is these other things as well in terms of who they are and what do they know. Knowing them better is going to help you teach them better. At the very least, they're going to start to believe that you actually care about who they are as an individual, which in of itself is extremely useful. But knowing their interests can give you better insight to helping them and relating to them. And that will in turn make them learn better from you. So keep those things in mind. So surveys isn't necessarily about the subject you're teaching, but it's about the student you're teaching. And you don't just teach subject matter, you teach students. And so when you go through and you're thinking about assessments and what you're designing, keep in mind that not all assessments are created equal. You have a whole slew of them to choose from. Some of them are required for you. And then there are lots that we haven't even touched on here, like exit tickets and warm-ups and other things like that. And if you ever want to hear my personal opinions on some of those other things as well, I can more than be happy to do those things as well. And just keep the idea in mind that there's not just one way to collect data from your students, and you should be collecting data from your students in lots of different ways. So when we talk about formative assessment versus summative assessment, formative informs your understanding of the student's knowledge. Summative is an example of what they learned. So the one is concurrently going along with their learning process, and one of them is after the learning has taken place. You have formal and informal as well. Informal would just simply be something like an exit ticket or a classwork assignment, as opposed to a formal assessment would be a test or project-based learning activity or something like that. All right, I hope this was useful. I hope this encourages you to become all that you can be as a teacher and more. So if you need additional explanation about any of these topics, please reach out and let me know, and I'll be more than happy to do a deep dive in any one of these. And please be looking for the deep dive on project-based learning and a couple others. Take care.